She was a sweet, innocent virgin girl, until she sold her destiny in a contract. She married a powerful, mysterious millionaire who seemed unable to feel desire, or so she thought. But time hides secrets and desires that can't be denied. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. The smell of disinfectant permeated every corner of the public hospital, mixing with the sweet, nauseating aroma of the medications her mother took 3 times a day. Rachel held Emma's cold, trembling hand, observing how the once rosy skin now appeared yellowish, almost transparent, revealing bluish veins that seemed to draw a map of pain. "Honey, you don't need to stay here all the time," murmured the woman, trying to force a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But Rachel knew. She knew that each word cost an immense effort, that each breath was a silent battle against a relentless enemy devouring her mother's body from within. From the other side of the curtain dividing the room, she could hear the muffled groans of other patients. It was a place where hope mingled with despair, where entire families broke down in tears in the poorly lit corridors. Rachel knew this routine well. For 6 months, since the diagnosis arrived like lightning, on a sunny day, her life had been reduced to this back and forth between the hospital, her job at Mr. Johnson's small market, and the simple house where she took care of her brother. Michael was only 16, but he carried on his shoulders the forced maturity of someone who grew up too quickly. The congenital heart disease they discovered when he turned 15 had transformed his dreams of playing professional soccer into a painful memory. Now he spent most of his time lying down, with a pale face and slightly bluish lips, controlling his breathing as if every movement was calculated. "Rachel, are you okay?" asked Michael when she arrived home that night, after another day at the hospital accompanying her mother's tests. He was sitting on the worn-out living room couch, leafing through a medical book he had borrowed from the school library. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile while taking off her worn shoes. The truth was that she was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Bills piled up on the small center table, and no matter how many double shifts she worked, the money was never enough. Her mother's treatment through Medicaid was slow, limited, and Michael needed tests that cost more than she earned in 3 months. That's when the letter arrived. A Tuesday morning, when the sun had barely risen and she was preparing for another workday, the mailman rang the doorbell. The envelope was elegant, made of thick paper she had never touched before. There was no return address, just her name written in impeccable calligraphy. Rachel carefully tore open the envelope, as if fearing its contents might disintegrate in her hands. Inside was a brief, direct letter, signed by someone who introduced themselves as a representative of Nathan Blackwood. The name wasn't unfamiliar to her. She had seen it in gossip magazines, economic news, always associated with scandals, power, and a seemingly endless fortune. The proposal was surreal. A meeting, a contract, an opportunity that would forever change her life and her family's. The words danced before her eyes. Marriage contract, 5 years, complete medical treatment, financial stability. It seemed like something out of a movie, like those melodramas she watched on Sunday afternoons when she managed to find some free time. "Michael, look at this," she said, handing the letter to her brother, who read it in silence, furrowing his brows. "Rachel, this can't be serious. It must be a scam, some kind of sick joke." But something inside her, an intuition she couldn't explain, told her it was real. Maybe it was desperation speaking louder, or maybe it was the feeling that the universe had finally decided to give her a chance to save her mother, to ensure Michael had access to the best cardiologists, to no longer have to choose between buying medications or paying the rent. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay looking at the ceiling of her small room, imagining what life would be like beside a man she didn't know, in a world she had never set foot in. The stories she heard about Nathan Blackwood painted him as a cold, calculating man, someone who turned everything he touched to gold, but who seemed incapable of feeling any kind of human emotion. Fear and hope waged a silent battle in her chest, but when she looked through the crack in the door and saw Michael coughing softly, trying not to wake anyone, her decision became clear. It didn't matter what price she would have to pay. It didn't matter what she would have to sacrifice. Her Family needed her, and she wouldn't give up. The address in the letter led her to a mirrored building in downtown Boston, where each floor seemed worth more than her entire house. Rachel went up in the elevator with trembling hands, watching the digital numbers marking her ascent to a world completely different from her own. The simple dress she had chosen, the best she owned, suddenly seemed inadequate, almost offensive amid so much luxury. The office on the 40th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city that she barely recognized from that height. Everything was impeccable, furniture with straight lines in shades of gray and black, works of art that probably cost more than she would earn in an entire lifetime, and a silence that seemed to swallow any sound. That's when he entered. Nathan Blackwood was exactly as the magazines described, but at the same time completely different. Tall, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled the dark tailored suit, he moved with the precision of a predator who knows exactly the size of his territory. His black hair was perfectly combed, and when his gray eyes met hers, Rachel felt as if she were being X-rayed, as if he could see through all her masks and fears. "Rachel Winters," he said with no trace of questioning in his voice. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, as if he already knew everything about her before she even set foot in that place. "Mr. Blackwood," she responded, trying to keep her voice steady, but feeling as if she were speaking to someone from another planet. He gestured for her to sit in the leather armchair in front of his desk, but remained standing, as if wanting to maintain the advantage of height and control. For a few seconds that seemed eternal, he merely observed her, and Rachel had the strange sensation that she was being evaluated like an object at an auction. "I imagine you've read the proposal," he finally said, his deep voice echoing through the office. "And I also imagine you're here because you desperately need what I'm offering." The words were direct, almost brutal in their simplicity. There were no pleasantries, no gentleness. Nathan Blackwood was a man who got straight to the point, and the point was that he knew exactly how desperate she was. "My mother," Rachel began, but he raised his hand, interrupting her. "I know everything about your mother. Pancreatic cancer in an advanced stage, 6 months of treatment through the public system, guarded prognosis. I also know about your brother Michael. Congenital heart disease, needing surgery that costs approximately $300,000. And I know that you work 60 hours a week earning minimum wage and a half." The precision of the information left her speechless. How did he know so much about her life? How long had she been observed, investigated? The feeling of invasion, mixed with a strange gratitude that finally someone completely understood the dimension of her desperation. "The contract is simple," continued Nathan, walking to the window and turning his back to her. 5 years of marriage. You will be my wife legally, will accompany me to social events, maintain the necessary appearances. In exchange, your mother will receive treatment at a specialized clinic in Switzerland under the care of the best oncologist in the world. Your brother will be operated on by the most renowned pediatric cardiology team in Europe." Rachel felt her heart race. It was everything she dreamed of, everything she needed. But there was something in his voice, a coldness that made her suspect there would be a much higher price than she imagined. "And what about—" She hesitated, feeling her cheeks redden. "What about the conjugal obligations?" For the first time, Nathan turned to look at her directly. His eyes had an expression she couldn't decipher. Was it disdain, amusement, or something more dangerous? "There will be no conjugal obligations," he said, and for a moment Rachel didn't know whether to feel relieved or offended. "This is a business contract, not a real marriage. You will have your own room, your own routine. Our interaction will be limited to the minimum necessary to maintain public appearances." The explanation should have reassured her, but there was something in the way he spoke that suggested the arrangement would be much more complicated than it seemed. Nathan approached the desk, resting his hands on the dark wooden surface and leaning slightly toward her. "There are some rules that cannot be broken," he said, his voice lowering a tone, becoming almost a threatening whisper. "You cannot talk about our agreement with anyone. You cannot try to manipulate or blackmail me, and you definitely cannot fall in love with me." The last sentence was said with such contempt that Rachel felt as if she had been slapped. His arrogance was impressive, as if she were just another desperate woman who would inevitably fall at his feet. "Don't worry," she replied, finally finding her voice and a bit of her dignity. "I don't have a habit of falling in love with arrogant men who treat people like objects." For a fraction of a second, something passed through Nathan's eyes. Surprise, interest. But the expression disappeared so quickly that she thought she had imagined it. "Perfect," he said, straightening up again. "The contract will be signed tomorrow. The ceremony will take place on Friday. Just civil, no party, no guests beyond the necessary witnesses." Rachel took a deep breath. It was her last chance to back out, to return to her simple and desperate life. But then she thought of her mother wasting away in that hospital bed, of Michael hiding his pain so as not to worry her more. She thought of all the nights she had cried silently, feeling powerless in the face of so much suffering. "I accept," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. Nathan nodded, as if he had never doubted her answer. He handed her a folder containing documents that seemed endless. "Read everything carefully, sign where marked, and Rachel—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers once more. "From tomorrow on, your life will no longer be yours. I hope you're prepared for the consequences." The ceremony lasted exactly 15 minutes, 15 minutes that forever separated the Rachel from before from the Rachel after. The courthouse was discreet, located in a wealthy neighborhood of the city, and the only witnesses were Nathan's lawyer, a middle-aged man who greeted her with cold politeness, and a secretary she had never seen before and probably would never see again. Nathan wore a dark grey suit that must have cost more than she would earn in 2 years. He was impeccable as always, but there was something in his posture that suggested impatience, as if he were just fulfilling another obligation on his agenda. When it came time to exchange rings, their hands touched briefly, and Rachel felt an electric shock run through her skin. He, however, showed no reaction. "You may kiss the bride," said the justice of the peace, following protocol. Nathan looked at her for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. Then he leaned in and touched her lips with his in a chaste, technical kiss, without any trace of passion or tenderness. It was like being kissed by a marble statue, beautiful, perfect, but completely cold. When they left the courthouse, a black limousine was waiting for them. The driver, an older man with a serious expression, opened the door for her with a respectful reverence that made her feel like an imposter. During the entire journey to Nathan's mansion, they didn't exchange a word. He typed something on his phone, completely absorbed, while she watched the city pass by the dark window. The mansion was in a gated community in Brookline, surrounded by gardens that looked like they came from an architecture magazine. It was immense, with modern lines and large glass windows that reflected the grey afternoon sky. When they entered, Rachel felt even more diminutive. The ceilings were high, the rooms spacious and decorated with a refined taste that screamed money and sophistication. "Mrs. Reynolds will show you to your quarters," said Nathan, indicating an elegant woman in her 50s who approached with a professional smile. "She is the housekeeper and will take care of anything you need." Mrs. Reynolds had grey hair tied in an impeccable bun and wore a discreet navy blue dress. Her eyes, however, were perceptive and seemed to be constantly evaluating everything around her. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, and the title sounded strange to Rachel's ears. "It will be a pleasure to serve you." Nathan had already disappeared up the stairs without saying goodbye, without explaining anything about the house routine or his expectations. Rachel followed Mrs. Reynolds through corridors decorated with works of art she didn't recognize, but which exuded importance and value. The room that would be hers was on the second floor, on the opposite side from the master bedroom. It was larger than her entire house, with a king-size bed, a balcony overlooking the garden, and a closet that could house the wardrobe of an entire store. There was also a small study, with a light wood desk and a bookshelf full of books. "Mr. Blackwood requested that I inform you about some house rules," said Mrs. Reynolds, closing the door behind them. "Breakfast is served at 7 sharp in the main dining room. The sir prefers that you be punctual. Lunches and dinners vary according to his schedule, which will be informed to you daily." Rachel nodded, trying to process all the information. All this seemed like a strange dream from which she couldn't wake up. "There's also the matter of the wardrobe," continued Mrs. Reynolds, opening the doors of the empty closet. "A personal shopper will come tomorrow to provide appropriate clothes for your new position. Mr. Blackwood has very specific standards about the public image of the family." So of course he did. Rachel remembered his words about maintaining appearances, about her being just a piece in his social chess game. That first night, she dined alone in a dining room that could easily accommodate 20 people. Nathan had gone, out for a business meeting according to Mrs. Reynolds, and would return late. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own footsteps on the Italian marble. Before going to sleep, she called Michael to find out how their mother was doing. Her brother's voice sounded excited. She had improved during the day. The new medications that Nathan had provided were already taking effect. Michael also mentioned that a private doctor had visited them to explain about the trip to Switzerland the following week. "Rachel, I don't know how you managed this," he said, his voice breaking, "but our mom is going to get better. I feel like everything's going to be all right." After hanging up, Rachel looked at herself in the mirror of the luxurious bathroom. The woman staring back wore a silk nightgown she had found in the drawer. Probably Mrs. Reynolds had provided it, but her eyes were the same as always, confused, frightened, but determined. She was beginning to understand that the price of saving her family would be much higher than she had imagined. It wasn't just about living as a stranger in a magnificent house or pretending to be someone she wasn't at social events. The real price would be living alongside a man who treated her like an expensive piece of furniture, necessary for decoration, but dispensable for any kind of real human connection. When she finally lay down on the huge bed, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Nathan had arrived. For a moment she held her breath, wondering if he would knock on her door, if they would say goodnight, if there would be any gesture indicating that they were now, technically, a couple. But the footsteps passed right by, and she heard his bedroom door close with a definitive click. That night, Rachel fell asleep with the strange sensation that she had just become a prisoner in a golden cage, where everything was beautiful and perfect, but where she might never be able to fly again. The first 3 months were a strange dance of mutual avoidance. Nathan left early for the office, and always returned after 10 at night. On weekends, he locked himself in his private study or traveled to resolve business in other cities. Rachel began to wonder if he was deliberately fleeing from her presence, or if that was really his natural routine. The personal shopper had transformed the empty closet into a collection worthy of a European princess. Designer dresses, Italian shoes, delicate jewelry that cost more than her old house, all carefully chosen to mold her into the perfect image of Nathan Blackwood's wife. When she looked in the mirror, sometimes she didn't recognize the refined woman staring back at her. Mrs. Reynolds had become her only constant companion, and gradually the housekeeper's professional coldness gave way to genuine cordiality. It was she who explained to Rachel about the social agenda she would need to fulfill, the important names she should memorize, the delicate nuances of Boston's high society world. "The sir is not an easy man," said Mrs. Reynolds one afternoon, as they had tea in the garden. "But he's not bad either, just wounded." Rachel looked up from the book she was reading, a biography of American businesswomen that Mrs. Reynolds had suggested so that she would better understand the environment in which she now circulated. Wounded how? Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, as if she were treading on dangerous ground. The Blackwood family has a complicated history. Mr. Nathan's father was a very cruel man. And the mother, she made a significant pause. Let's say she wasn't exactly maternal. Before she could ask for more details, the sound of Nathan's car arriving interrupted the conversation. Mrs. Reynolds immediately changed the subject, but Rachel kept those words as clues to a puzzle she was trying to piece together. The first social event happened in the 4th week of marriage. A charity gala at a 5-star hotel downtown, filled with businessmen, politicians, and socialites. Rachel wore a navy blue dress that enhanced her eyes and left her shoulders bare, and when she descended the mansion stairs, Nathan stopped in the middle of the entrance hall and looked at her for a moment longer than usual. "You look appropriate," he said, but there was something in his voice that suggested more than simple protocol approval. Throughout the event, he was the perfect husband in the eyes of others. He placed his hand on her back to guide her between groups, introduced her with evident pride, and even smiled occasionally when someone made a complimentary comment about her. But Rachel felt that she was playing a role, and Nathan was too. Was that night that she met Victor Sullivan? He appeared at the end of the party, when most of the guests had already left. As tall as Nathan, but with brown hair and green eyes that seemed to analyze everything with a predatory intensity. He wore an impeccable tuxedo and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My dear half-brother," he said, approaching with open arms, in a gesture that seemed friendly, but carried a palpable tension. "And this must be the famous wife." Rachel felt Nathan tense beside her. His hand, which was lightly resting on her back, closed into a fist. "Victor," replied Nathan, his voice icy. "I didn't know you had returned to Boston." "There. So many things you don't know about me, little brother," said Victor, taking Rachel's hand and bringing it to his lips in a chivalrous kiss that lasted a bit longer than socially acceptable. "Enchanted, Rachel. May I call you Rachel, right? After all, we're family now." There was something in the way he said the words that made Rachel feel uncomfortable. It was as if he knew secrets about her that she herself didn't know. "Let's go," said Nathan abruptly, pulling her by the arm. During the journey back home, the silence was different from the usual. It wasn't the polite indifference of always, but a tension she could cut with a knife. Nathan drove with his hands tight on the steering wheel, and she could see his clenched jaw in the reflection of the glass. "Who exactly is Victor?" she finally asked. Nathan took so long to respond that she thought he was going to ignore the question completely. "My father's illegitimate son. He first appeared when I was 15, claiming an inheritance that was never his. My father threw him out, but Victor always comes back, like a plague." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. Rachel realized there were very deep wounds there, scars that perhaps had never really healed. When they arrived home, Nathan headed straight for his study, but stopped at the base of the stairs. "Rachel," he said, without turning to look at her, "keep your distance from Victor. He's dangerous in ways you can't imagine." Later, as she prepared for bed, Rachel reflected on that night. She had felt something different in Nathan when Victor appeared. It wasn't just irritation or discomfort. It was something more primitive, more intense. Protection? Jealousy? Or simply territorialism? She had also noticed how he had observed her during the party. She thought he wasn't paying attention, but several times she had caught his grey eyes following her movements across the room. When she talked with other men, his hand would appear on her back as a silent signal of possession. As much as she tried to convince herself that it was just part of the act, something inside her had responded to those gestures. And that scared her more than she was willing to admit. That night, she fell asleep thinking about Nathan's warning about Victor, but also about the way he had said her name. For the first time, it hadn't sounded just like an obligation. It had sounded almost as if he really cared. The flowers arrived on a Thursday morning when Rachel was having coffee alone on the back porch. An immense bouquet of red roses with a card that simply said, "For the new jewel of the Blackwood family. With admiration, V." The sweet and intense perfume of the flowers suddenly seemed sickening, almost suffocating. Mrs. Reynolds appeared on the porch with a worried expression, carrying the vase as if it were a bomb about to explode. "Ma'am, Mr. Nathan needs to see this," she said, extending the card. Nathan was in his study when they looked for him. He read the card in silence, and Rachel saw his expression progressively harden. Without saying a word, he took the vase and threw it into the study fireplace, where the roses turned to ashes in a matter of minutes. "Victor must not have access to this house," he said to Mrs. Reynolds, his voice sharp as a blade. "Reinforce security. And you," he turned to Rachel, "don't accept anything that comes from him. Flowers, gifts, invitations. Nothing." "Nathan, what exactly does Victor want?" asked Rachel, tired of being treated like a child who didn't deserve complete explanations. For the first time in months, he looked her directly in the eyes for more than a few seconds. There was something there that she couldn't completely decipher. Anger, yes, but also something that seemed suspiciously like fear. "He wants to destroy everything that is mine," he finally said. "And now that includes you." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with a meaning that neither was ready to explore. Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine, and she wasn't sure if it was from fear or something more dangerous. In the following days, Nathan subtly changed. He was no longer avoiding her presence with such determination. He started coming home earlier and sometimes joined her for dinner. The conversations were still limited to safe subjects: business, the social agenda, general news. But there was a different tension in the air, as if both were constantly aware of each other's presence. It was during a particularly silent dinner that Rachel decided to break the unwritten rules of their strange coexistence. "Tell me about your mother," she said, putting her fork aside and facing him directly. Nathan stopped chewing, and for a moment she thought he would simply stand up and leave the room, as he always did when she tried to cross the boundaries he had established. "Why do you want to know?" he finally asked. "Because we've been married for 4 months, and I know absolutely nothing about you. And because—" she hesitated, seeking courage. "Because sometimes I see something in your eyes that suggests you're not the cold man you pretend to be." Nathan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was a bitter, almost cruel laugh. "My mother was a beautiful woman," he said, leaning back in his chair and studying her, as if deciding how much he could reveal. "And completely incapable of love. She confused affection with manipulation, care with control. When I was a child, she only hugged me when she needed something from my father, and when he died—" Nathan paused, his eyes lost in some distant memory. "She told me I was exactly like him, cold, calculating, incapable of feeling." "And do you believe that?" asked Rachel softly. "I was," he replied, but there was a strange vulnerability in his voice. "Until—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes met hers for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. Rachel felt her heart race, as if she were on the verge of discovering something important, something that would change everything between them. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the phone. Nathan answered with his mask of professional coldness back in place, but Rachel had seen what was underneath it. There was hunger there was desire, and there was a loneliness so deep that it made hers seem superficial. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stayed on the balcony of her room, watching the city lights, thinking about the conversation during dinner. She was beginning to understand that Nathan wasn't cruel by nature. He had been shaped by cruelty, taught that any display of feeling was a weakness that would be exploited. That's when she heard footsteps in the hallway. It was almost 2 in the morning, and Nathan normally slept deeply after his exhausting days. She opened the door a crack and saw him standing in front of her room as if he were fighting against some internal impulse. For a moment, their eyes met through the crack in the door. There was something wild in his expression, something that made her instinctively step back, but there was also a vulnerability that attracted her like a magnet. Without thinking too much about what she was doing, she opened the door completely. "Nathan?" He remained motionless for a long moment, like a wild animal deciding whether to attack or flee. Then, slowly, he approached her. He stopped just a few inches away, so close that she could feel the heat emanating from his body, the smell of his masculine cologne mixed with something purely male that made her legs tremble. "You should be afraid of me," he said, his voice hoarse and low. "Should I?" She whispered, surprised by her own courage. "I'm not a good man, Rachel. I'm not capable of the things you deserve." "How do you know what I deserve?" Nathan raised his hand as if to touch her face, but stopped mid-movement, leaving it suspended, in the air between them. "Because you are light," he finally said, "and I am darkness, and darkness always destroys light." Before she could respond, he stepped away and disappeared down the hallway, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the strange sensation that something fundamental had changed between them. That night, for the first time since the marriage, Rachel dreamed of Nathan. And in the dream he wasn't cold, he was pure fire, consuming everything around him, including her. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Nathan began working from the home office on Friday afternoons, and Rachel discovered she could hear him talking on the phone if she stayed in the adjacent library. His voice during business meetings was completely different from the one he used with her. Assertive, relentless, without any trace of the vulnerability she had caught that night in the hallway. Mrs. Reynolds noticed the change too. During breakfast on a Monday, when Nathan left later than usual, the housekeeper made an apparently casual comment. "The sir has been sleeping poorly lately," she said, serving more coffee to Rachel. "I hear him walking the corridors in the early hours." Rachel felt her heart race. Could it be possible that she wasn't the only one being affected by that growing tension between them? "Maybe it's work stress," she replied, trying to sound natural. Mrs. Reynolds looked at her with that perceptive expression that suggested she knew exactly what was happening. "Mr. Nathan is not a man who lets himself be easily affected by work. Ma'am, he has been dealing with business pressures since he was 15. This is different." Before Rachel could ask what she meant by different, the phone rang. Mrs. Reynolds answered with her usual efficiency, but her expression changed dramatically during the conversation. "Ma'am," she said, covering the mouthpiece of the phone, "it's from the hospital in Switzerland, about your mother." The world seemed to stop. Rachel took the phone with trembling hands, preparing for the worst. But the doctor's voice on the other end of the line brought news she hardly dared to hope for. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm pleased to inform you that the treatment is being exceptionally successful. The tumors have significantly decreased, and your mother is responding better than we expected." Rachel collapsed into sobs of relief so intense that Mrs. Reynolds had to hold the phone for her. When she finally managed to compose herself, she immediately called Michael, who was equally emotional about the news regarding the heart surgery that would be performed the following week. That's how Nathan found her when he arrived home early that afternoon, sitting in the garden with tears in her eyes but smiling for the first time since he had known her. Her genuine, radiant smile that completely transformed her face. "Good news?" he asked, stopping a few meters away. "My mother is getting better," she said, wiping away tears. "And Michael is going to have surgery next week. I don't know how to thank you." Nathan was silent for a long moment, observing her. There was something in his expression that she had never seen before, a quiet satisfaction, almost tender. "You don't need to thank me," he finally said. "It was part of our agreement." But the way he said it didn't sound like a simple business transaction. It sounded as if seeing her happy was reward enough. It was that week that Olivia Montgomery reappeared in Nathan's life. Rachel was choosing clothes for a charity event when she heard raised voices coming from the study. One was Nathan's, tense and irritated. The other was a woman's, with a refined accent and an imperious tone that cut through the air like a sharp blade. "You can't simply ignore me forever, Nathan," the female voice was saying. "We had something special, and you know that." "What?" "We had ended 2 years ago, Olivia, and you know exactly why." Rachel recognized the name. Olivia had been mentioned in gossip magazines as Nathan's last serious lover before the marriage. A high society woman, owner of a renowned art gallery, known as much for her beauty as for her explosive temperament. "Because of this farce you call marriage?" Olivia's voice rose. "Nathan, we both know it's just a contract. You don't love this girl." Rachel felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. That's exactly what she was, a girl in a contract. But hearing it from someone else, said with such disdain, hurt more than she expected. "My personal life is no longer your business," replied Nathan, his voice icy. "She's not your equal, Nathan. She never will be. You can dress her in expensive clothes and teach her to walk in our circles, but she will always be a girl of humble origin, pretending to be something she's not." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel held her breath, waiting for Nathan's response, part of her dying of fear that he would agree with Olivia. "Get out of my house," he finally said, but his voice sounded strange, as if he were fighting against something. "Now." "This won't end like this, Nathan. You know you belong with me, and when you get tired of playing house with this child, I'll be waiting." Rachel heard high heels walking away, followed by the sound of the front door closing forcefully. Then, absolute silence. She stood in her room processing what she had heard. Olivia wasn't wrong. She really was an imposter in that world, pretending to be something she would never be. But Nathan's hesitation in defending her had hurt more than the other woman's insults. When she went down for dinner that night, Nathan was visibly tense. They ate in silence for a few minutes before she gathered the courage to speak. "I heard voices in the study today," she said, trying to keep a casual tone. Nathan stopped eating and looked at her directly. "Olivia stopped by," he said, without beating around the bush. "It won't happen again." "She wasn't wrong about some things," said Rachel, surprising herself with her own courage. "I really don't belong in your world." "Rachel." "No, it's okay. I always knew that. But," she took a deep breath, "I'd like to know if you regret it, our agreement." Nathan studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he got up from his chair and walked to where she was sitting. He rested his hands on the arms of her chair, leaning, until their faces were just a few inches apart. "What I regret," he said, his voice low and intense, "is not having met you in a different way, under different circumstances." "Nathan. And what I regret most," he continued, his eyes fixed on hers, "is that I'm starting to care about you in a way I shouldn't, in a way that could destroy us both." Before she could respond, he stepped away and left the room, leaving her alone with her heart beating so hard that she was sure it echoed throughout the entire house. That night, Rachel finally admitted to herself the truth she had been avoiding for months. She was falling in love with the husband she should never love. The change happened on a Saturday morning, when Rachel woke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs. It was 7 in the morning, and Nathan was never home at this time on weekends. She went down the stairs in her nightgown and robe, finding him in the kitchen, collecting the shards of a broken cup with his bare hands. "Nathan, you'll cut yourself," she said, quickly approaching and kneeling beside him. "Let me do that." "I can do it," he replied, but his voice sounded strange, almost broken. That's when she noticed. His hands were trembling almost imperceptibly, and there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he had spent the night awake. When he raised his eyes to meet hers, Rachel saw something that left her breathless, pure vulnerability, as if all the masks had finally fallen. "Nightmare?" she asked softly, covering his hand with hers. Nathan remained motionless for a moment, as if her touch was simultaneously a relief and a torture. Then slowly he intertwined his fingers with hers. "I dreamed of my father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was telling me I would destroy everything I touched, as he always did, as he always used to do." Rachel felt her heart break. Without thinking twice, she moved closer, putting her free arm around his shoulders. To her surprise, Nathan didn't pull away. Instead, he rested his forehead on her shoulder, and she felt the full weight of the world he carried alone. "Your father was wrong," she said, stroking his black hair. "You didn't destroy anything. You saved my family. You saved me." "I'm not good for you," he murmured against her shoulder, but his arms closed around her waist, contradicting his own words. "Why don't you let me decide that?" Nathan pulled back enough to look her in the eyes. There was an internal battle happening there, and Rachel could see every nuance of the struggle between what he wanted and what he believed he deserved. "Because when I allow myself to really touch you," he said, his voice hoarse, "I won't be able to stop. And that will change everything between us." "Maybe I want everything to change," she whispered, surprised by her own courage. Nathan's expression completely transformed. The controlled and calculating man disappeared, replaced by something wild and hungry. He raised his hand and touched her face with a delicacy that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. "Rachel," he said, as if it were a prayer or a curse. She thought he was going to kiss her. Every fiber of her being expected it, longed for it, but instead he pulled away abruptly as if he had been burned. "I can't," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Not like this. Not when you don't really understand what you're asking. Forati. Before she could respond, the house phone rang. Nathan answered with his usual automatic efficiency, but his expression changed dramatically during the conversation. Understood, he finally said. Double the security, now. When he hung up, his face was pale. What happened? Asked Rachel, feeling a chill run down her spine. Victor was seen prowling around the house during the night, said Nathan, already pulling the phone again. And there's more. Olivia was seen with him last night at a restaurant. The implication of the words hit Rachel like a punch. Victor and Olivia united against them. It was an alliance that didn't bode well. They're working together. It seems so. Victor wants to destroy me, and Olivia... Nathan hesitated. Olivia has always been obsessed with control. If she can't have me, she'll try to ensure no one else can. And I'm the easiest target, completed Rachel, understanding the situation. Nathan approached her again, but this time there was no vulnerability in his eyes. There was pure determination and a possessiveness that made her heart race. No one is going to touch you, he said, his voice low and dangerous. No one. At that moment, Rachel understood something fundamental about Nathan Blackwood. He wasn't just a man who avoided feelings for fear of being hurt. He was a man who avoided feelings because when he finally allowed himself to feel, the intensity was overwhelming. The following days were tense. The security of the house was reinforced, with discreet but visible guards at the gates and gardens. Nathan cancelled several business trips and began working exclusively from home. Olivia tried to call several times, but he simply ignored the calls. It was during one of those afternoons when Rachel was reading in the library and Nathan was working in the adjacent study that she heard a phone conversation that made her freeze. Yes, I understand that the contract is approaching its end, said Nathan, his voice formal and distant. 4.5 years. We still have time for necessary adjustments. Rachel felt the world collapse. For a moment, she had forgotten that all this had a deadline, that in a few months, when they completed 5 years, she would return to her simple life and he would go on with his. The idea of leaving him now, after everything that had happened between them, was unbearable. But there was something in his voice that intrigued her. When he talked about necessary adjustments, he didn't sound like someone who was anxious for the contract to end. He sounded like someone who was trying to find a way to extend it. That night, during dinner, Rachel made a decision that would change everything. Nathan, she said, putting her fork aside, I need to tell you something about how I feel about us. He looked up from his plate, and she saw fear quickly pass through his expression before he managed to hide it. Rachel, don't... I've fallen in love with you, she said, the words coming out before she could regret them. I know that wasn't in the contract. I know you didn't want this, but it happened, and I can't pretend anymore that it didn't happen. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan looked at her as if she had just confessed to a terrible crime. You don't know what you're saying, he finally said, but his voice was hoarser than normal. I know exactly what I'm saying, and I know you feel something for me too. I can see it in your eyes, in the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Nathan abruptly got up from his chair, walking to the window. Even if that were true, he said without turning around, it wouldn't change anything. I would still be the same man who was taught that loving is synonymous with destroying, and you would still deserve someone better. What if I don't want someone better? She asked, standing up too. What if I just want you? When Nathan finally turned to look at her, Rachel saw something break inside him. It was as if all the barriers he had built over a lifetime were finally crumbling. The storm approaching Boston that night seemed a perfect reflection of what was happening inside the mansion. The winds howled through the gardens, and the first lightning bolts cut through the dark sky when Nathan finally approached Rachel in the dining room. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel something for you. Something that terrifies me, that goes against everything I've learned about myself. Rachel felt her heart race but said nothing, fearing that any word might break the spell of that moment. From the first day, continued Nathan, stopping just a step away from her, I tried to convince myself that you were just part of a business deal, but you—" He raised his hand, delicately touching her face. "You illuminate places inside me that I thought were forever dead." "Nathan—" "No," he said, placing his thumb over her lips. "Let me speak, because if I don't say this now, I may never have the courage again." A lightning bolt illuminated the entire room, followed by thunder that made the windows shake. "I've fallen in love with you, Rachel. Slowly, tortuously, desperately. And it goes against all the rules I established myself, against everything I believed about myself." His words were like a balm for all the insecurities she had carried during the last months. Without thinking, she moved closer, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the accelerated beat of his heart. "Then why do we fight so hard against this?" she asked. "Because once I really touch you," he said, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Once I allow myself to love you completely, there will be no going back, and I don't know if I'm capable of giving you the kind of love you deserve." "What kind of love do I deserve?" Nathan smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, it was a genuine smile without masks or defenses, gentle, patient, pure. He paused, his eyes roaming her face as if memorizing every detail. "And my love is hunger, Rachel. It's possessiveness. It's a need that can consume everything around it." "Maybe I want to be consumed," she whispered, surprising herself with her own boldness. Something changed in Nathan's eyes. The last barrier, the last vestige of control, finally collapsed. He pulled her into his arms with a force that took her breath away, and when their lips finally met, it was as if the whole world caught fire. The kiss had none of the technical coldness of the courthouse. It was pure hunger, years of repressed desire exploding between them. His hands tangled in her hair while she clung to his shoulders as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had become liquid. When they separated, both were breathless. Nathan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if he were trying to anchor himself in reality. "Rachel," he said, his voice hoarse, "if we go ahead, I can't promise I'll be able to let you go when the contract ends." "Who said I want to go?" He opened his eyes, and what she saw there made her tremble. It was pure desire, yes, but it was also love. Real love, intense, frightening in its depth. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. Rachel didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, and he led her upstairs, through the corridor she had walked so many times alone, to his bedroom, a territory that had always been forbidden. Nathan's room was an extension of his personality. Clean lines, dark, colors luxurious but without excess. The king-size bed dominated the space, and large windows offered a panoramic view of the city. But Rachel barely noticed the details. All her attention was focused on the man in front of her, on the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever seen. "Are you sure?" he asked, even knowing he was beyond the point of no return. In response, she approached and slowly began to unbutton his shirt. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was determination in every movement. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," she said. Nathan closed his eyes when she touched the bare skin of his chest. It was as if each caress was simultaneously a relief and a torture. When he touched her in return, it was with a reverence that left her breathless. His hands explored every curve of her body, as if he were discovering something sacred. The storm outside intensified, but inside the room there were only the two of them, finally giving in to what had been growing between them since the first séance. When Nathan finally laid her on the bed, when he finally allowed himself to love her completely, it was as if 5 years of denial and repressed desire exploded all at once. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't the romantic first encounter of fairy tales. It was raw passion, desperate need, two human beings who had denied their feelings for so long that when they finally allowed themselves to feel, it was overwhelming. Afterward, when they lay intertwined, listening to the rain hit the windows, Nathan traced invisible patterns on Rachel's skin. "I don't regret it," she said softly, as if she could read his thoughts. "Neither do I," he replied, pulling her closer. "For the first time in my life, neither do I." They fell asleep like that, completely entangled, as if they wanted to make up for all the months of forced distance. But what neither of them knew was that Victor had chosen exactly that night to implement his most cruel plan. While they slept in each other's arms, finally complete, an envelope was being slipped under the front door of the mansion. Inside it, photographs and documents that Victor had carefully forged, false evidence suggesting that Rachel had been his accomplice from the beginning, that the entire marriage had been part of an elaborate plan to destroy Nathan from within. The storm that had witnessed the birth of love between them had also brought the seeds of their temporary destruction, because sometimes true love needs to be tested by the worst lies so that its real strength can be revealed. That night, for the first time in 5 years, Nathan slept without nightmares, but when he would wake up the next morning and find that envelope, the nightmare would only be beginning. Rachel woke up alone. The bed still held the warmth of Nathan's body, and for a moment she smiled, remembering every second of the previous night. It had been more than she had ever dared to dream, not just the physical passion, but the emotional connection, the vulnerability he had finally shared with her. For the first time since she had arrived at that house, she truly felt at home. The smell of coffee came from the kitchen, and she imagined Nathan preparing breakfast for both of them, perhaps for the first time as a real couple. She put one of his shirts over her naked body and went down the stairs with a light heart, anticipating the first day of their lives together, without masks, without pretense. But when she reached the dining room, she found a Nathan completely different from the man who had loved her the night before. He was sitting at the table, still wearing the wrinkled clothes from the day before, with an open envelope in front of him and an expression on his face that instantly froze her. "Nathan?" she said hesitantly. "Is everything okay?" He raised his eyes to her and Rachel stepped back. It was like looking at a stranger. All the tenderness, all the vulnerability he had shown the night before had disappeared, replaced by a coldness that was even worse than the initial indifference. "Sit down," he said, his voice sharp as glass. Rachel obeyed, feeling a growing fear settling in her chest. Nathan pushed the envelope across the table to her. "Open it," he ordered. With trembling hands, she removed the contents of the envelope. Photographs of her talking with Victor in places she didn't even remember visiting, documents that seemed to show bank transfers from Victor to an account in her name. Emails she had never written, but which seemed authentic, detailing a plan to seduce Nathan and destroy him from within. I don't understand," she stammered, leafing through the papers with growing horror. "This isn't real. I never—" "Not real." Nathan abruptly stood up, his voice rising. "There are photographs of you with Victor. There is evidence of payments. There are messages detailing exactly how you were supposed to manipulate me. Nathan, you have to believe me. I've never seen these documents before. I barely spoke to Victor beyond that day at the party. Someone is trying to separate us." The laugh that came from Nathan's throat was bitter, cruel. "Separate us? Rachel, we were never really together. You did exactly what you were paid to do. Pretended to be innocent, pretended to care about me, pretended—" He stopped, his fists clenching. "Pretended everything last night." The words were like stab wounds. Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes, but forced herself to stand, to face him directly. "How can you say that? After everything that happened between us, after what you told me about your feelings." "I said what you wanted to hear," he said, his voice now icy, calculating. "What you needed to hear to complete your mission." "No," Rachel shook her head desperately. "No, you can't believe this. You know me, Nathan. You know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," he said, approaching her like a predator. "You're a talented liar, a convincing actress, and I was fool enough to believe your performance." Each word was calculated to hurt, to destroy, and it was working. Rachel felt as if she were falling apart inside. "Please," she whispered, extending her hand toward him. "Please don't do this. Don't destroy what we have because of lies." Nathan looked at her extended hand as if it were something repugnant. What we have? He repeated, his voice overflowing with contempt. We have nothing. We never had anything. You were very well paid to pretend we did. And your family? He said, continuing his methodical destruction. I imagine your mother's treatment and your brother's surgery were generous bonuses for a job well done. Stop, said Rachel, now openly crying. Stop, please. You're destroying everything. I'm saving what's left of my dignity, replied Nathan, and ending this farce before it goes too far. He walked to the table and picked up a pen, scribbling something on a paper. This is a check, he said, extending it to her. For the rest of your services, consider our contract terminated. Rachel looked at the check without touching it. It was an obscene amount, more money than she would see in several lifetimes, but it looked like blood on her hands. I don't want your money, she said, her voice breaking. I want you. I want the man who loved me last night. That man never existed, said Nathan, turning his back to her. It was just an illusion you created very well. Nathan, she made one last desperate attempt. If you throw me out now, if you destroy this, there will be no going back. You know that, don't you? That's exactly what I'm hoping for, he replied, without turning around. Leave my house, Rachel. Leave my life, and never come back. The cruelty in the words finally broke her last resistance. Rachel ran upstairs to her room, threw some clothes in a small suitcase, and came back down. Nathan had disappeared, probably locked himself in his study. Mrs. Reynolds was in the entrance hall with tears in her eyes. Ma'am, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding, she began. Take care of him, said Rachel, quickly hugging the housekeeper. He's going to regret this, and when he does, be here for him. When the mansion door closed behind her, Rachel felt as if a part of her soul had been left behind. She had nowhere to go, no one to call. Her previous life had been completely absorbed by that new reality, and now she was alone in the world, without ties, without destination. It was only 3 weeks later, when she was in a small hotel in a town in the interior, working as a waitress to be able to pay for her stay, that she discovered. The morning sickness she had attributed to stress, the delay she had ignored in the emotional confusion. She was pregnant. Pregnant with the child of the man who had loved her for one night and expelled her from his life the next morning. Pregnant, and completely alone, carrying within her the only real proof that that night had happened, that the love between them had been real. That night, in a small, dimly lit room, miles away from the mansion, where she had been truly happy for a few hours, Rachel cried until she had no more tears, and then, placing her hand on her still flat belly, she made a silent promise. No matter what happened, she would protect that child, even if it meant never seeing Nathan Blackwood again. Nathan discovered the truth in a way that completely destroyed him. 2 months after expelling Rachel, Mrs. Reynolds appeared drunk at his door, laughing like a madwoman as she confessed everything. How she and Victor had worked together to forge the evidence, how they had hired a forgery specialist to create the documents, how the photographs had been digitally manipulated. You should have seen your face, said Mrs. Reynolds, stumbling through the study. When you believed that your precious wife had betrayed you, it was delicious. Nathan was paralyzed for a moment, processing the magnitude of his own stupidity. Then a fury like he had never felt took over him. He expelled Mrs. Reynolds from his house and immediately called his most competent private investigators. Find Rachel Winters, he said, his voice desperate. Now, move heaven and earth, but find her. The weeks that followed were Nathan's private. Hell, he discovered that Rachel had simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed her. She wasn't using credit cards, didn't have a cell phone, didn't maintain contact with anyone. She had become a ghost, and he began to fear he would never see her again. Mrs. Reynolds was arrested for document forgery and blackmail. Victor disappeared abroad when he realized his plan had been discovered, but Nathan knew he would eventually find him too. Neither of them mattered now. Only Rachel mattered. It was the investigators in Greece who finally located her. A young, pregnant American woman working as a freelance translator on a small island in the Aegean Sea. When Nathan received the call confirming it was her, He felt as if he could breathe again for the first time in months. He took the first flight to Athens, then a ferry to the island of Santorini. The storm that was punishing the region that night was fierce, with winds that cut the skin and rain that transformed the narrow streets into small rivers. But Nathan didn't care. She was there, just a few kilometers away. He found her in a small, white house on the cliffs overlooking the stormy sea. Through the window, he could see her sitting in an armchair, one hand resting on her now quite voluminous belly, reading a book by the light of a lamp. The storm had knocked out the island's electricity. When he knocked on the door, the silence that followed was deafening. He could imagine her shock, her fear, perhaps even her anger. He deserved all of it and more. "Rachel," he said through the door, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "It's me, Nathan, please, open the door." When she finally opened it, Nathan felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. She was pale, too thin except for the belly carrying his child, and there was a fragility to her that hadn't existed before. But her eyes still shone with the same strength that had captivated him from the first day. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I discovered the truth," he said, soaked by the rain, trembling not. "Just from cold, but from emotion. About Victor, about Mrs. Reynolds, about the lies. Rachel, No," she said, shaking her head. "No, you can't just show up here and—" A sudden contraction made her double over in pain, clutching the doorframe. Nathan reacted instinctively, holding her before she fell. "The baby," she said, breathless. "It's coming." The storm had isolated the island. There were no boats, no helicopters, no way to reach the hospital on the main island. Nathan carried Rachel inside, his heart racing with panic and adrenaline. "I need hot water, clean towels," he said, vaguely remembering things he had seen in movies. "Do you have a phone, someone who can help?" "The midwife," said Rachel between contractions. "Maria, Yellow House, 2 streets down." Nathan ran through the storm like a madman, knocking on doors until he found Maria, a middle-aged Greek woman who spoke a Portuguese mixed with English. Together they returned to Rachel's house. During the hours that followed, as the storm raged outside and Rachel struggled to bring their son into the world, Nathan held her hand and whispered words of love, of regret, of promises he planned to keep for the rest of his life. "I love you," he said when she screamed in pain during a particularly strong contraction. "I've always loved you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for being stupid enough to believe those lies." "Nathan," she said, tears mixing with sweat on her face, "I never stopped loving you, not for a second." When the baby was finally born, when Nathan heard the first cry of his son cutting through the sound of the storm, he knew his life had changed forever. Not just because he was now a father, but because he had found his way back home. "It's a boy," said Maria, placing the baby in Rachel's arms. Nathan looked at the son he didn't even know existed, small, perfect, with a dark head of hair identical to his, and felt something definitively break inside his chest. All the walls, all the defenses he had built over a lifetime, collapsed at once. "May I?" he asked, extending his arms. Rachel smiled through her tears and placed the baby in his father's arms. Nathan looked at that little face and knew he would give his life to protect this child and the woman who had brought him into the world. "What should we call him?" he asked. "Michael," said Rachel. "Like my brother, the boy you saved." Nathan kissed his son's forehead, then leaned down to kiss Rachel with all the tenderness and love that had been denied them for so long. "Home," he said. "Let's go home. All together. And Victor and Mrs. Reynolds." "Let me take care of them," said Nathan, his voice assuming a dangerous tone for a moment before softening again. "Nothing and no one will separate us again, I promise." 6 months later, they renewed their vows in an intimate ceremony at the Boston mansion, with Michael in Rachel's arms and tears of happiness in the eyes of all present. Mrs. Reynolds was in prison. Victor had been extradited and faced charges for fraud, and the family they had built was finally complete. That night, as they watched Michael sleep in his crib, Nathan held Rachel in his arms and finally understood what his mother had never been able to teach, that loving wasn't weakness. It was the greatest strength a human being could possess, and he had almost lost his out of pure pride and fear. "I love you," he whispered in the dark. "Forever?" she asked, echoing the words of the vows they had exchanged that afternoon.